So I'm going to talk to you today about the Ringling Brothers. And you may have heard a little connection to Stillwater, so we'll talk about that too. But they moved around a lot as children, and this really shaped what they became later on in their lives. So we'll start with the family and with their father specifically. So he came over to the United States from Germany in 1848. He came to Milwaukee by way of Canada, and he was working as a harness maker there. And he changed his name. It was Ringling to start, a little more German. He changed it to Ringling within a year of being there. And he met his wife a couple of years later. They married in 1852. Her name was Marie Salome Juliard. And what's interesting about her is she had a couple of sisters. One married a man with the last name of Golmar. They also moved to Baraboo, and their sons formed a circus of their own, the Golmar Brothers Circus. Her other sister married a man by the name of Moeller, who had a wagon shop in Baraboo, and they built wagons for the circus, both for the Ringlings and the Golmars and other circuses throughout the area. So these three sisters had a tremendous impact on circus in general and in Wisconsin specifically, which is kind of interesting. So they lived in Milwaukee for a couple of years, but they first moved to Baraboo with their oldest sons, Al and Gus, in 1855. And August, their father was working as a harness maker at that time. But there was an economic downturn. He had his own shop. He wasn't able to keep that open. And so they moved to McGregor, Iowa. And they stayed there for 12 years, which is longer than they stayed in most other places. They had 3 more kids there before they moved across the river to Prairie du Chien, spent a little time there. And that's when they came to Stillwater. So they were in Stillwater in 1875 for 3 whole months. Not a huge impact probably on their lives, but it was captured by the Minnesota State Census in 1875. So it's in paper. If you go online, it's been digitized. You can see their names and lived in Stillwater. So definitely had an impact on them, right? But just in general, the moving around, their father sometimes had his own harness shop. Sometimes he worked for others, but he taught his sons those skills as well. And so they all developed, a handiness and, a toughness as well. They didn't have a lot of money. They, were resourceful, and they used that later on as they grew up. And so we have a couple of photos here showing the young family about 1865. And then when they were grown up, they were already in their circus career. You can see that there are 7 boys there and 1 daughter. There were only 5 brothers who were actually the named partners in Ringling Brothers. The 2 others worked for the show as well, and we'll talk about that. And then their sister, her children actually became involved in the show later on too. So it was definitely a family affair for everybody. But a little bit about them as children, because that really, you could already see what they were going to become from that time. So McGregor, being on the Mississippi, was a popular destination for circuses because a lot of circuses at that time were on steamboats. They traveled the river and stopped in towns along the way. So McGregor saw 3 to 4 circuses a year in the 1860s. And so the boys got their first glimpse of the circus at a pretty young age. And it made a really big impression on them. So much so that they organized their own circuses. Kids mimic what they see, right? And so they had a parade that was marching through town. They rounded up the local cats and dogs and rabbits and chickens and who knows what else to put on shows, to have their little menageries, do all the things that they saw in the circus. And they learned some of those skills. They learned to juggle, they learned balancing, things like that. And so this really developed at a young age. Al, the oldest boy, was the one who had the biggest interest in it. And he started working as he grew older for various shows in the region. He was known as a strong man. He was also known for juggling. One skill that was written up in the newspapers very frequently was him balancing a plow on his chin. I don't know. I don't know how someone develops a skill like that, but it was notable enough that it was mentioned in numerous newspapers over the years. So I guess it was a sight to see. But he started to learn what the circus industry was a little bit more. Soon some of his other brothers joined him. John worked as a comedian. Elf T and Charles were very musical. Their mother had that influence on them. So they played a number of different instruments and they sang as well. So these are all skills, you know, they were honing that served them later on when they decided to start their own circus. So on the left over there, you can see an illustration. Elf T, one of the brothers, wrote the history, their story in 1900. So at that time, they had been doing their circus for 16 years. So he thought it was time to reflect back on their beginnings, I guess. And he was a wordsmith, and so, you know, it was beautiful. But there was all these illustrations throughout the book that depicted their childhood in McGregor and what they did with the circus, which I think is pretty lovely. The next image there is the first time Al Ringling has, you know, top billing in an advertisement. You can see that there. That dates to about 1881, so 3 years before they started their own circus. But he did a little bit of everything because he kind of had to at that point. And so he started to also organize a musical hall show with his brothers. It was called the Ringling Brothers Classic and Comic Concert Company. I have to read all these names because I cannot remember. They used a lot of words, a lot of alliteration and stuff, but that was the first thing that they put out, and that debuted in Mazomanie, Wisconsin, which is not terribly far away from Baraboo, November 27th of 1882. So in that, there was a little bit of mixture of music and circus to that they would play in, you know, theaters and halls in small towns throughout the region. Al did plate spinning and juggling. Elf T led the band and played the cornets. Charles led the orchestra and played the euphonium, the bass, and the violin. So multi-talented there. John and Otto, their other brothers, joined them soon as well. And it was through doing these musical hall shows that they gained the experience that they needed for the circus. You know, they learned about promoting themselves and advertising, learned about booking venues and, you know, all of those things that you need, tracking down horses and wagons to carry your stuff from place to place. So after doing that for a little over a year, they decided they were ready. They wanted to do start their own circus. And so they opened May 19th of 1884 in Baraboo. You can see the name there, Yankee Robinson and Ringling Brothers, Great Double Shows, Circus and Caravan. Also a mouthful. That is the first, that is the only time that someone else's name was actually before their own. So their first season out, they partnered with a man named Yankee Robinson, who was an old hand in the circus business. He was known by everyone. So he had the name recognition to get people in the door, also a little bit of money, you know, the capital to get this show going. And so he traveled with them that first season, but he passed away at the end of the season. And so after that time, they were on their own. They sometimes worked with other people, but their name was always first. They made sure of that. So when they went out in 1884, their tent held about 600 people. It was 45 feet by 90 feet. So you can, you know, picture that. And they spent 19 weeks on the road. They had about 115 shows that they did during that time. And they went through Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa. You know, they're just traveling the nearby places there. So there was juggling, there was contortionists, there was balancers, there was comedy acts, there was all the musical acts. They had a couple of people working for them. It was mostly the brothers just doing their thing, going from place to place. So let's talk about the brothers. These are the 5 managing partners of the Ringling Brothers. So you may have seen posters for Ringling Brothers that has, you know, the 5 faces of them. Can't really tell them apart. Lots of mustaches, sort of look the same. But we have them here. I mentioned Al being the oldest of the brothers. And he was the leader, he was the public face of the show. From the early days, he was the equestrian director, so all of the horse acts that took place, he managed them. He was also in charge of all of the programming that happened. He hired the performers. He was also very interested in the spectacles. So spectacles in the circus, if you're not familiar, are grand theatrical productions that went on. They would open the show up, and they would often be based on historical stories or Bible stories, things that people recognized and knew. So you could learn all about Cleopatra or King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba or Joan of Arc or Cinderella. So they just involved elaborate costumes, lots of people, just getting people excited. The spectacle, the name is fitting because it was just a giant spectacle of it. And so Al was in charge of all of those. And then at the end of the show, they would have hippodrome races, excuse me. And so Al also was in charge of those. Next was Otto, and he was the money guy. He was the financial genius of the show. And if it wasn't for him, they probably would not have succeeded in the way that they did. In the early years, though, he did a little bit of everything. He was, the advance man. So he went out in front of the show to drum up excitement for it. He took tickets at the door, a little bit of everything. But he was the treasurer, and he was very into all of the details. He is the reason that they purchased some other circuses, which we'll talk about as well, and helped them to grow as much as they did. Elf T up top there in the middle, he's the one that wrote the book I mentioned. He was a wordsmith. And so he did a lot of the press for the show. The circuses put out what were called route books, which was essentially a yearbook for the circus. At the end of the season, they would put out everywhere they had been during the year and what happened there. So, there's a couple of times they came to Stillwater, and so they talked about people visiting the prison. And one day it was really rainy, and so not a lot of people came to the show. So just these little details, as well as listings of all of the performers, all the people who worked for the show. So you can learn all of these specifics about the show from these route books. They were also full of, beautiful flowery language, and that was all Elf T who did that. He was very good at that. He also, as I mentioned earlier, was musical. So he played the cornet, he played violin. And so that was a lot of what he did in the beginning. So another important part of the press was cultivating relationships with newspaper editors around the country. Because obviously you want favorable articles written about your show. So you make friends with them, right? And then they say all sorts of nice things about you in the show, and that helps them succeed. So Elf T was very good at that. Charles is the next one, and he is the guy that most of the performers, other staff on the show looked most favorably on. They called him Mr. Charlie. He was around the show grounds lots all the time. He was always willing to talk to anybody that was there. He was friendly, and so lots of people have really fond memories of him. He was the most musical of all of them, so that was something he was very involved with. From the beginning, playing them, and later on composing and arranging all of the music that was played during the show as well. And he also took on advertising, so figuring out what all of the posters would look like and things like that. Last up is John, and he was the youngest of the five there, and he was also very detail oriented. He was in charge of scheduling, so he knew all of the roads, all of the train routes, everything throughout the whole country. You could name a city and he could tell you what county it was in throughout the whole country, because he had to know that. He had to know where people were excited to see the show, where you should just route around and avoid because you weren't going to get good business there. So all of those, everything about transportation, he was an expert on. So, all together. John figured out where they were going. Al arranged what they were going to be showing there. Elf T did all the advertising for it. Charles kept an eye on, the competition, all the other shows out there, and Otto dealt with all of the money. So they all had their, specific roles that they played in the show. And because of that, and because they trusted one another, they were very successful at that. So there were a couple other brothers, as I mentioned before. We have Gus and Henry. So Gus in the beginning was not interested at all in the circus business. He got married, he moved to Minneapolis, he was working as a carriage trimmer up there. And it wasn't until 1890 when the show was going to transition from being an overland or a wagon circus onto railroads that he decided to move to Baraboo and join his brothers. He was going to be in charge of the advance brigade. So there was a rail car that went out a couple weeks ahead of everybody else, and that was going to be his domain. And so he was content to not be a partner, just to work for the show and be doing that. And then he later on helped to manage other advertising departments when they purchased other shows as well. Henry there joined as soon as he, turned 18, so out of his parents' house, which was a couple years after the show started. And he was in charge of the big top, so he was the face everybody saw when they were coming into the show. And so I mentioned before that the cascading brothers, you'll see that image a lot because they use that in publicity, to show all the brothers. It showed unity, it showed loyalty, all of those things that family demonstrates, right? But if you look at them, you can sort of tell them apart. Al's got the biggest mustache, so you can keep an eye out on that one. John's in the middle. He looks a little bit different than the others, so you can point him out. But then it's like, oh, okay, which one's Charles and which one? Yeah, so I can't always tell. If they're not in their proper order, I can't always tell. So a little bit about the show in the early years. I mentioned they were an overland show, which meant they traveled by wagons, which really limited where they could go and how many people could see them because, you're at the mercy of the weather, you're at the mercy of the crummy roads, everything like that. So you get rain, your wagon gets stuck, you maybe don't get there. So in those first few years, they were just traveling in a very, small regional area. And they weren't making a lot of money in the beginning. They kept doing the musical hall shows during the winter to try and build up some capital to use for their summer circus show. Because in general, circuses would go out in the spring, they would perform until the fall, and then they would go into their winter quarters. But in those first few years, they did not spend time in their winter quarters, they just kept working. But that allowed them to keep the show going. They were also, pretty tight-fisted. They didn't spend money they didn't have, which was the downfall of a lot of circuses. You have these grand dreams and plans, and if it doesn't work out, you're in trouble. They didn't do that. They also had a no-grift policy on their show. Lots of other shows in the newspapers referred to them as the Sunday school boys. But they thought it was important that people felt safe coming to their show. A lot of other circuses, especially in the 19th century, had unsavory types that came along with the show and were pickpockets. They knew as a captive audience, people were enjoying everything they saw and maybe weren't paying attention to their money. But the Ringlings hired Pinkerton detectives. They kept them on staff. And so they made sure if someone got robbed while at their show, they, made someone pay for it. And so they got this reputation, but it helps them grow too, because it was all wholesome and wonderful. Families wanted to come to this show because it was not one of those seedier circuses that existed. So that helped them too. First couple of years, they were, pretty bare bones, as I mentioned before. They started their menagerie in 1886. At that point, zoos didn't exist like we think of today. So a lot of people hadn't seen different types of animals that you couldn't see in the forest or on the farm field, right? So that first year they had a hyena, bear, monkeys, and an eagle. Their hyena was blind, apparently. Who knows if this is a story or not, because circuses make stuff up all the time. You have no idea what is true. But I have to read to you how they advertised this hyena, whether he was blind or not, who cares? He was a mammoth, midnight, marauding, man-eating monstrosity, the prowling, grave-robbing demon of all created things. Who doesn't want to go see that, right? So that's how they sold it. That's how you get people excited, right? Wow, look at that animal. It was probably just this poor little sad hyena, but they sold it and got people excited for it. A couple years later, 1888, they acquired their first elephants. And you weren't considered a real circus until you had elephants, so they made it at that point. 1888, they were, with the big boys. Their tents were also growing. 1886, so 2 years after they opened, essentially doubled in size. It was a 90-foot round instead of a 45 by 90. And at that point, they also had a sideshow tent, and they were up to 18 wagons in their, circus. So it was definitely growing. By 1887, they started expanding into Nebraska, into Kansas. So they were traveling a little bit further, but not, too much. But in 1890, they transitioned to rail. They realized they couldn't grow as a show if the region that they could perform in was so limited. So they had, the capital to invest in rail cars at that time. And so they took to rail. So at that time, they named their show Ringling Bros United Monster Railroad Shows Menagerie and Museum. I was a mouthful, but that's what it was. Hence, most people just refer to it as Ringling Brothers, right? Because how can you remember all of those things? So in 1890, they were up to 225 employees at that time. So, no small feat. They went out on 18 rail cars. So that was a couple of advertising cars that went out, weeks ahead of the show to drum up business. They had one sleeper car for the performers. They had one sleeper car for the working man, one elephant car, 5 stock cars, and 8 flat cars. Because at that point, they had 15 cages of animals and over 100 ponies that were with them as well. So thinking about all of that and how much room it takes up, they needed the cars for that. From the time they went to rail, though, they came to Stillwater. They were here in both August of 1890 and they were here in August of 1892. And so those are the only 2 mentions I could find that they performed here. Later on, they were in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, but they were here in Stillwater at that point. But that's when they were starting to move a little bit further east as well. They went to Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia. And so because of being on the rail, they were able to see a lot more people. And they were starting to make a lot of money. So in 1891, their profit was at that time $86,000. So looking at what, converting that to today's money, it was $2.8 million that they made in profits. So not too shabby, right? And those numbers just continued to grow as well. So I said in 1890 they had 18 rail cars. They were up to 56 by 1897. So the 1890s were pretty good for them. And by the 1920s, which is when they combined with the Barnum and Bailey show, you can see the lithograph there, they had 100 cars. So it just kept getting bigger and bigger. So these photos show you a little bit of, what it was like. I mentioned the advertising car a few times. You can see an example of one of those cars there, the men who worked there. On the top right there, that is in Baraboo. So they built in 1912, I think is when it actually opened, car shops. So that was to store all of their rail assets during the winter. So that's probably only about a quarter mile as the crow flies from where the museum is located, where the winter quarters were. But it is a huge building and it could hold all of those rail cars, protect them from the winter, give them a space to work on them, if they needed repairs or changes or things like that. And bottom right there shows, you know, how the loading and unloading process worked. They had their baggage horses. At one point, I think early 1900s, they were up to 600 baggage horses that they had, you know, with the show to do all of the work, pulling the wagons around and, you know, getting everything set up. So that shows the loading, but it also shows on the left there all the milling around, just a whole lot of horses there that they were responsible for. And so if you think about that, all of those animals, think about feeding them. That was another thing that had to be coordinated every stop, making sure they had food for all of these animals. And it added up.
Is that building still in Baraboo, standing?
Yes.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, so it's funny because, so it's right along the Baraboo River. There's a river walk on the opposite side. In the summertime, you can't see it at all because of all the trees and everything. And in the winter, you can just see how massive it is. It's actually behind, there's a St. Vinny's that's there, and it's just right behind there. And so we store our real assets there now. From the years when we did the Great Circus Parade, we have a bunch of rail cars as well. So they're all stored over there where the Ringling stored theirs. So Ringlingville, we'll talk a little bit about. This is their winter quarters. So this is where Circus World is in Baraboo. That's why we were founded there. It is where the Ringling brothers had their winter quarters from the 1880s up until 1918. So as I mentioned, circuses would come back to their winter quarters in October, November, you know, when the weather was starting to turn. And this was their time to get ready for the next year. You know, do all the repairs that they had to do on the wagons. They would start planning what the advertising was going to look like. They'd be sewing all the costumes, things like that. Problem was they weren't taking in any money, you know, between November and May, April, usually. You had expenses to feed all those animals and pay your staff, but they weren't bringing money in. That's why they had to make that profit during the summer season. So when we opened at Circus World, we had what was their 1901 ring barn and their 1915 camel house. Those are still there. We acquired additional buildings over the years. So top left there, there was a workshop. So you can see all of the different things that were in there. So that's sort of the edge of the property there. They first bought along the Baraboo River there in 1886 is when they purchased a factory along there to start storing some of their equipment. And then as they started earning more profits for the show, they started to build buildings for all of the work that needed to be done. And so looking at the Sanborn maps from the 1880s up until 1915, it changed a lot because originally they were building more frame structures, which were not quite as strong and permanent. But as they had a little bit more money in the late 1890s and early 1900s, they transitioned to building a lot more brick buildings. They had seen what fire could do to circus winter quarters. It would be devastating. It would take out whole buildings and kill animals and hurt people. And so they wanted to try and avoid that for themselves. And so they started having more brick buildings. And they never had a fire in the winter quarters in Baraboo. But so every couple of years they would build more buildings. 1897 is when the elephant house went up along with an animal house. Another animal house was added in 1901 along with a ring barn. They had a few different camel houses over the years, the last one being constructed in 1915. And so those are all there. But imagine what it was like for the residents of Baraboo at the time, because they would take the elephants out for walks, right? Give them their exercise. So you would look out your front window and see elephants walking by. For a lot of Midwesterners who probably had not seen elephants outside of the circus, that's pretty amazing. Even a couple of years ago, one of our elephants kind of escaped a little bit. She walked across the river and started eating someone's flowers across the street. And it was funny because, so obviously everybody knows where the elephants came from, right? And so my boss or director and the elephant trainer went over there and go, Kelly, and she looks at them and she follows them because she knew she wasn't supposed to be there, but she was just enjoying some flowers, right? It made international news. I've seen stories, in Asia, people are talking about elephant loose in Baraboo, Wisconsin. But that was how the day went at that time. And imagine the sights and the sounds and the smells and all the things that would come from this property where you have hundreds of animals. Like I said, the horses alone, some of the horses were stored in farms a little bit further outside, but on the property itself, a couple hundred of the horses were, as well as the camels and the elephants and the zebras and the lions and tigers and bears. And it had to have been pretty amazing. And I guess they give tours and things like that so people could come see what it was. Unfortunately for us, there's not a lot of photos that show the inside of any of these buildings, so we don't really know what they looked like, which is too bad. But there's quite a few of these exterior shots. So, getting to see, you can stand right where those elephants are in that photo and think about how they were practicing 100 whatever years ago, which is pretty amazing. The one on the lower left there, that's inside our ring barn, which is still, one of the buildings we had. That was for the performing horses or the ring stock. But you can see she's got a harness attached to her there. So the connection is still in the ceiling in our ring barn now, but that was for what was called the mechanic. Obviously, if you're thinking about equestrian acts and you're jumping and doing somersaults and all of those things, you can't just do that without practicing, right? You don't want to fall off every time. So they had what was called the mechanic. And so that would, someone would be on the other end to help out, but that would ensure that if you were practicing something and you slipped a little bit, horse didn't trample you or you didn't hurt yourself too bad. And so we have photos of inside the ring barn where they're practicing zebra acts and horse acts and things like that. So it's pretty fun. But even just the line of camels outside of the ring barn there, it's just fun to stand in those places where those animals were and be able to see all of that. And then wardrobe department, that is actually a building that we do not own. It's across the street from our property. It's now the Baraboo Art Center. So there's events and things like that we can rent out, but that's where their wardrobe department was. But look at all of those costumes there, because these theatrical productions by 1910 or so, they would advertise that they had 1,000 performers who were, taking part in these spectacles. It wasn't maybe quite that high, not that they lied, but they would enlist every single employee they had. Someone who was caring for animals would have to put on a costume and, make a loop around the ring just to, be another person in that spectacle. And all of that was planned in Baraboo, which is kind of incredible. These things that people were seeing all over the country were impacting millions of people, was being planned in this tiny little town. But we get that all the time at the museum, why Baraboo, why is it here? It's because they were there and it just happened. I mean, it could have happened in any number of places, but it happened there. So they anointed themselves the world's greatest. A lot of circuses love to put these titles on it. So you can see a poster, the one on the left there, they called themselves the kings of the circus world, and called it the world's greatest shows there. So you can just see the scope, how much it was growing by that time. By the mid 1890s, they were opening their show every year in Chicago. That let them start a little bit earlier because it was an indoor engagement. And so you didn't have to worry about the weather as much. You can work out the kinks in the show, but hopefully, rake in a little bit of money doing it. And it also proved to both themselves and the broader public that it wasn't just rural audiences who were interested in what they were doing, because the people of Chicago came out. They did really well there. And then they moved on to St. Louis, and they went to Boston, and all of these cities also really got on board and were excited about that. And so in 1895, their profits, in today's money, we're up to $7.5 million for the year. So it was just, growing by leaps and bounds. They gained even more notoriety in the late 1890s because Barnum and Bailey Circus, which had been, the biggest name up to that point, and obviously P.T. Barnum's name was known to everybody. They decided to do a European tour. So Barnum and Bailey went over to Europe between 1898 and 1902. And that meant things were kind of open for the Ringling Brothers to take over. There was often with circus gentlemen's agreements where they would, keep to different territories so they weren't, stepping on each other's toes too much. But, the country was an oyster at that point, and they were able to grow a lot during those years because they were the big show that came places.
And this kind of entertainment was different from which I think is at the same period, the Wild West shows that were, right?
Some were, so there were separate Wild West shows, like Buffalo Bill had a Wild West show, and they would do the roping, and they would also do their own sort of spectacles, like things that are not entirely appropriate in today's, Indians chasing settlers kind of thing. But a lot of the larger circuses often had their own Wild West portions to them. Lots of times it was, pay a little extra money and go see this Wild West show. So it was an add-on to the regular show. And then sometimes there were Wild West, trick roping and riding and things like that were incorporated into these larger circuses. But there were definitely shows that were purely Wild West that traveled around as well.
That didn't have the circus.
That didn't have rights. Yeah, and Buffalo Bill is the biggest name associated with that. There was also Pawnee Bill, there was the Miller Brothers had one too. So that was often separate, but as time went on, a little bit more that was incorporated into some of the traditional circus performances. The Ringling Brothers, though, kept growing. In 1905, they purchased half of the Avonfour Ponsell's Brothers show, which was another one of the big names. James Bailey, who was of Barnum and Bailey, owned the other half of that show. But he passed away in 1906, so they bought that other half. So they owned all the four Ponsell's. And it was after James Bailey's death that they purchased Barnum and Bailey as well. And so most people don't realize that beginning in 1907, the Ringling Brothers were running both the Ringling Brothers and the Barnum and Bailey Circus. They put them out as two separate shows. They still ran Ringling Brothers out of Baraboo, and they ran Barnum and Bailey out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, where their winter quarters were. But they were in charge of it. Barnum and Bailey didn't exist at that point. They had both passed, and it was the Ringling Brothers who were doing all of that. So they ran them as separate shows, but obviously they were the ones that were making the money on it. And they were able then to use the strengths of one show to help bolster the other show sometimes. And so this is when, the money started to become sort of crazy. Their profit in 1909 with the two shows was $32 million. And so, compared to 10 years before, it was, less than 10 million. So it was growing quite considerably. And so by their 25th year, they had over 1,000 employees, 600 horses, 40 elephants, 80 rail cars. Their tent could hold 12,000 people. So just think of the magnitude of that. Going to a circus with 12,000 of your closest friends, and entire cities would shut down when the circus came to town. It was the largest form of entertainment at that time because there wasn't a lot of else going on. Yeah.
All the take to set up a tear down.
They were amazingly good at it. They did all of this in a day, because they would often roll into town early hours of the morning. They would start setting up. They had both employees on their regular payroll, and then they would hire roustabouts, in the towns themselves. They would get it all set up. The parade would happen usually about 10 o'clock. They would get back from the parade. The matinee show happened about 2. The big top show, happened that night, and they would be out of there by, midnight at the latest. And then they would tear everything down and do it all over again. Sometimes in large cities, they would stay for a couple of days, but a lot of these smaller towns, coming to Stillwater, it was a day, engagement. But they would also play, they played Black River Falls, and they would play other towns that were not terribly far away. So the train ride didn't take them a long time, but they were a well-oiled machine. Even by the time World War I rolled around, the government was watching the circus and how they handled loading and unloading because they were so good at it. Why reinvent the wheel? Take what they had learned after decades of practice. But they could do it all really quickly. And it was a whole city, the showgrounds lot. This photo from Red Wing shows you a little bit about that. You can see the big top tent, and there's generally a sideshow tent and a menagerie tent, and then there's the cookhouse tent, because they would serve thousands of meals a day to all of the employees. And then there would be different dressing tents, and then, it's a little bit of everything. They had their own post office for the circus. It was a mobile post office, obviously, because it moved around. But they had, the blacksmith shop. They had the doctor. They had all of those things that you need. It was all within what they were doing there. So it's pretty incredible when you think about the sheer volume and magnitude of all of that.
It was one that came to Hugo at Trout Air in '89 in May.
Okay.
They started at 5
Mhm.
because we slept in the car.
Oh, right. And yet people would come out to see the whole production. They would come out to watch them unloading the train, because that is a sight to see itself, and then to set everything up, and then the parade, and then the shows. It was a whole, cities would shut down, schools would be closed, businesses would be closed, because everybody wanted to go see the circus. A lot of that was due to the advertising that they did. Advertising was a big deal, and really circuses changed what advertising was and meant in this country. From the earliest newspaper advertisements in the 1790s, they started using different sized fonts and different typefaces, and they started to include illustrations. And these are all things that had not been done in papers before. So by the time, the Ringling Brothers rolled around, you can see some of the different types of advertising they had. One of the biggest ones was the parade, because that was free. Anybody could come see that, but you'd get a glimpse. They wouldn't show you all the good stuff. You see some of the elephants, you wouldn't see the rhinos, though. You wouldn't see the hippos, because you have to pay money to come see those. But the sights, the sounds, the smells, all of those things. You hear the Calio playing, and okay, the circus is in town, I gotta see that. You don't want to miss out if everybody else is going to it, right? And so the parade was one of the biggest pieces of advertising that they had. But in general, their success relied on the effective advertising. The lithographs were a big part of that, because you have tigers jumping off the page at you. You have ballerinas pirouetting on top of a horse. You have an aerialist just flying through the air. All of these things, it gets your imagination going. You want to see that in real life, right? As we mentioned before, hyperbole was definitely something utilized by the circus. Everything was exaggerated. Although it's interesting, there's a story that John Ringling wrote in 1919, just about, because at that point, a number of his brothers had passed, things had changed a little bit. He was reflecting on his years in show business. He said, people expect the exaggeration. They know it's not all true, but they expect to see that. They're okay with it. Whether that's the truth, I don't know. But it was definitely utilized in a lot of the circus advertisements. As I mentioned before, the brothers, like you see in the one in the middle there, their portraits there, they used that in the term brothers to instill confidence in the public on what their show was. So many circuses used that brothers terminology. At least they were actually brothers. There are many shows out there that used brothers that, no, it was just one of those things that looked good, right? So I talked a little bit about the advanced team before, who'd go out 2 to 3 weeks ahead of the show. They would secure the showgrounds lot that they were going to be performing on. They'd pay the local licenses and fees that were needed. They secured the food that would be needed for both the people and all of the animals. And then the crew would be responsible for papering the town, advertisements all over. There's 4 different jobs. Bannermen, bill posters, lithographers, and programmers, and they each had specific things that they did. So they would travel together in one of those advertising cars that I showed you before. The bannermen would put up the oversized posters. So posters could be anywhere from a 1 sheet. A 1 sheet is about 28 inches by 42 inches. And so a lot of the circus posters that you see are that. Posters could go up to 100 sheet, though. I think that's the largest that ever existed. So they would put on the sides of big buildings. They would use fence posts. They would put on barns. Anywhere that there was a circus to hang on, they would hang on it. If there was a farm along the railroad tracks, they would go up to the farmer. They say, hey, can I give you a couple tickets to hang some posters on your barn? And they would say, sure, right? I get to go to the circus for free. And so that's what they did. Often they would hang 6,000 to 8,000 posters a day. So just think about how many that is. It's pretty crazy to think about. So yeah, I said the bannermen would do the oversized posters on the like large multi-story buildings, and they would use magnetic hammers and tacks to do that. There's lots of stories of them eating bread to try and deal with the tacks that they had swallowed because they'd have them in their mouth and have their magnetic hammers.
No.
The bill posters used flour paste and brushes to put on, more single sheet posters on smaller buildings, fences, things like that. Lithographers put posters in store windows, obviously talking to store owners again and trying to get them to agree to that. And the programmers handed out the heralds and the couriers. So heralds are those, like on the right there. It's about 10 by 28 inches. And so those were distributed anywhere that public gathered, stores, barbershops, post office, things like that. Sometimes they even delivered it to every store or every house in town. That was something else that, mass mailings and things like that. The circus were all over all of those things that are still used today. And so they were generally mostly black and white. Sometimes you get a little bit of red, but not a lot of color. For the couriers, which is the one in the middle, is more of a booklet. It could be, anywhere from 4 pages up to probably 50 pages long. And it would just extol all the virtues of the show. I don't know how much you can read this, but it's, 50 reasons why the Ringling Brothers had the world's greatest show. Really? I don't know what they all are. I don't know if I can read them, but it's, we have all of these rings, we have all these rail cars, we have these animals. So if someone really took the time to read it, good on them, I guess. But I like the photo in the middle there too, because that shows you what they would do and how could anyone miss that? Obviously, you know that Ringling Brothers is coming May 29th, hard to avoid that. And so people would see it, they would get excited, they would go watch the show. But as I mentioned, the biggest form of advertising really was that parade. And from the beginning, the Ringling Brothers first parade was probably 5 minutes long, super short and sweet. And it was up to, I think, 45 minutes by 1900. So it was a pretty impressive parade. And they would have these bandwagons intricately carved. So for those of you who aren't aware, at Circus World, we have the largest collection of circus wagons in the world. We have about 250 of them in our collection. And they have these elaborate carvings on the side, their artwork, and that was something a lot of times they would be covered in gold leaf. And so they're shiny and beautiful, and who wouldn't get excited to see some of those? There would be bands, there were bands that were mounted on horses. There were bands who were riding on top of wagons. It was hundreds of horses would be going along as well. And as I mentioned, you get to see some of the animals, but not all of the animals. There was cage wagons that they would be in. So you could maybe hear that tiger roar, but you couldn't see it because the sides were out. So, it's there, but you don't get a glimpse of it. So you have to go pay money to see the show in the menagerie in order to see those kinds of things. They would also do unusual things like the one on the bottom there, the Ringlings had a 16 camel hitch, which was unheard of other shows. They also did a zebra hitch, which not a lot of people did. Barnum and Bailey had a 40 horse hitch, which is a pretty big deal as well. Something that was recreated at the Great Circus Parade in Milwaukee for a number of years too. They talk about the length of the reins for those, because when the horses take a turn, there's like 100 feet of reins that are feeding through your hands. I can't imagine that. But that is a little bit, and advertising was a big deal. They made sure everybody knew it was free. You can come to the parade, it's free, because they were hoping to hook them and then get them to pay money to see the main show.
Were the shows expensive?
It was expensive for farmers who didn't have a lot of money to go around and maybe had a bunch of kids that they wanted to bring to it. But the circuses made it possible with some of those by giving out the free passes for advertising and things like that. And so, by the 1890s, I think for the big shows like this, I think they charged 50 cents for an adult and 25 cents for a child. So I don't know what that equals today. It wasn't like super cheap, but it was the kind of thing that people would save up for, because they knew the circus was going to come. And so you make sure that one thing that you do, during the year was go to the circus. So they continued on with the two separate shows, as I mentioned, until 1919, things changed. And so they left Baraboo, Ringling Bros left Baraboo in the spring of 1918, seemingly intending to come back, but they didn't. And there was a lot of factors that went into this decision. Al Ringling had passed in 1916. He was the biggest fan of Baraboo of all of the brothers. He built his home there. It was, where he wanted to spend his time. Compare that to John, who called them Baraboobians and built his house in Chicago. Yeah, that's a name that has withstood. Great, right? But he looked down on Baraboo as being this backwater place, and instead preferred the cosmopolitan Chicago. So Al had passed away. He had talked before in the past of potentially leaving Baraboo for a multitude of reasons, but decided to stay. The brothers all had a vote. They came to a consensus to make those big decisions. After he passed, John had a little more sway with that. And so that was one reason. Another reason was the pandemic had really affected the circus. They closed early in 1918, as a result of that. The other thing was, the war was still going on. The United States had rail restrictions, and there was talk that, why are we letting these big circuses use the rail? We should be using them for more important things, dedicated to the war. And so they worried that they'd get stuck somewhere and they couldn't go anywhere, so they couldn't make money, they couldn't get home, any of those things. So those all came together, as well as, labor shortages. Obviously, men were over in Europe fighting, and there weren't as many men to pick up these roustabout jobs and things like that they needed to survive. And at the same time, so they're running these two giant shows. And so they decided it really wasn't feasible to be doing that anymore. So they decided they were going to combine in 1919 into one show. and they decided to quarter that show in Bridgeport, where Barnum and Bailey had been. So they just didn't come back to Baraboo. They sent both trains to Bridgeport, and then they started making the decisions of what assets to get rid of, what they needed for the show. You know, it meant some performers didn't have jobs anymore because they couldn't take everybody. It meant that you know, they got rid of some animals. They would generally sell them to zoos and things like that, because obviously being out in Connecticut, it meant they were close to a lot of those larger markets. And so, and too, in general, entertainment was changing. You know, while this was the premier form of entertainment for people for decades, now things like movies and dance halls and other things were starting to grow in people's interests, and so circus really didn't hold the same place. But in 1919, they went out. They combined the show into 92 rail cars for the next year. And this was, you know, the largest they had ever been. The tent was about 2 football fields long. It could hold 16,000 people. There's 28 other tents in the whole tent city there. I mean, it was monstrous. They had 38 elephants performing together, which is the largest herd that there had ever been. And so at that time, the show became a little bit more about the sheer size of it all and a little less about the, you know, theatrical performances that Al Ringling had been such a fan of. That sort of fell by the wayside a little bit. So as I mentioned, Al passed in 1916. Alf T died in late 1919. So at that time, Charles became the general manager of operations, and John managed the winter quarters and the routing. Charles passed away in 1926. More changes happened. Pretty much it was John taking over everything. He didn't actually own all the shares at that time. That had transferred to some of the, you know, sons and widows of his brothers, but they sort of let him do what he wanted until that caused problems. Because 1929, he decided to purchase the American Circus Corporation, which was 5 of the biggest competitors they had. It was the Sarasota Circus, Hagenbeck Wallace, L.G. Barnes, Sparks, and John Robinson. And so he spent a lot of money. That was in August, I think. We all know stock market crashed, right? And so there was not a whole lot of money left. 1932, he was ill as well. And so he was pretty much forced out. He was seen as being, you know, infirm, not making good financial decisions. And so there was a little bit of a coup that happened with what had been a close confidant of him and a couple of widows of his brothers. They took over. He was still the named president, but he didn't have any power at that time. And then he passed away in 1936. Ringling Brothers obviously continued. You know, they kept growing. They kept getting bigger. I think both of these photos are pretty fantastic in the middle there, because it shows how big it really was. You know, all the personnel there in the top photo. And then they opened in Madison Square Garden every year. And it just shows all the people who are watching and then everything happening in the ring there. Yeah. And that just, it kept growing. But to a lot of changes were happening. Less people were being interested in circuses and things like that. They last went out under canvas in 1956. By that time, it had transferred back to a Ringling running the show. It was the son of their sister Ida who was in charge at that time. And he decided that they would start performing in arenas and venues like that instead, because it was just getting to be too hard moving around with the tent. But then by 1967, the Ringling sold the show. So they sold it to the Feld family, Irvin Feld and his brother Israel. And they took over and they really rejuvenated it. They started on 2 separate units at that time. They introduced Clown College. You can see a photo of Irvinfeld on the right there with his son Kenneth with Clown Alley, because they realized at that time a lot of the clowns were getting older. They, the joke was they could fall and not get back up again. And so they needed some new clowns in the business, and so they opened college. And college was free, so people could come to it. And then some of them would get jobs in the show at the end of the, clown college. And so it renewed the interest in that, and people, started coming back. And they returned to the glitz and glamour, as you can see by the costumes there. All throughout the rest of the time, the costumes all look like that. And so it really did revitalize what was there. But, that didn't always continue. So by 2017, Irvinfeld died in the early 80s and his son Kenneth took over. In the early 2000s, he started working with his daughters. He made them get 2 real jobs outside of the circus before they came to work for him, though, and he was not their boss because he didn't think that was a good idea. But his daughters all work for Feld Entertainment now. So Feld is what put out Disney on Ice, and they now do all of the monster truck shows and BMX something, I don't know. All of those big arena things that, come to cities. But in 2017, they decided to close down Ringling because the high operating costs and the diminished attendance at the shows didn't make it viable anymore. However, the Ringling story is not over because it is reopening in 2023 with a renewed format. Nobody really knows what that means. So we're all waiting to see. But it's reimagined and we're excited to see what will happen. It's supposed to open fall of 2023. So this show, went out for a few years, but is coming back. And it's just interesting to look at the longevity of that, longer running than any other shows, obviously. And really, it has a lot to do with the Ringling Brothers. They were successful because of their upbringing. They were poor boys who found ways to entertain themselves and be useful, and they developed these skills. And what everybody talked about was their partnership with one another. They trusted one another. They were never going to just do majority rules. They would talk it out till everyone decided that it was the best decision for the show. That's pretty, you hear a lot about families and business, and it doesn't always go that well, but I think it's remarkable what they were able to achieve, and the legacy is still there. Yeah.
Did they also have a base down in Sarasota?
So when they left Baraboo in 1918, they went out to Bridgeport. They decided to leave the Bridgeport winter quarters in 1927, and that's when they moved down to Florida. And that was mostly because John had, developed a love for the area, and so he made that decision to move down there. And so the winter quarters were based out of Sarasota or Venice for the remainder of the time, and that's where Feld's offices are down there today as well. Obviously, it makes a lot more sense to have winter quarters in a warmer area because they had all of these exotic animals and bears during the winter. Obviously, 35 elephants generates a lot of body heat. The building was probably warm.
Yeah.
Maybe didn't smell great, but it was warm. But yeah, and now there's a very large circus community down in the Sarasota area as well, because people would build homes down there too. So when they were off the show for the, for the break, they would have a place to go.
All these images that you showed of newspaper clippings from the day, are those on exhibit? Are they in the archives?
They're in our archives. They're not all on exhibit, but so we have a separate library and research center. We have 10,000 posters. We have probably more than 500,000 photos. We have a large amount of information there.
Are the books, like the accounting books or scheduling information, did they keep the brothers?
We have some of that. So when, I said they left Baraboo, they left a lot of stuff in Baraboo when they took off because I think they intended to come back. A lot of those costumes made it back to us, which is great. Apparently people would go and, find Halloween costumes in the old Ringling buildings for a number of years, but ended up being donated back to us. There were a lot of records left in the office that were taken out between the 30s and the 50s by different fans. A lot of them have ended up at the Milner Library in Bloomington, Illinois State, and we have some as well. We have more records. We have all the American Circus Corporation records, Ringling records going back to the teens, but then all these 5 other circuses. So, from 1929, we can go get a ledger book and see what they were paying for specific things at certain times and look at all of those numbers, and it's quite fascinating.
The animal rights, that affect this very much.
Yeah, that definitely went into their decision to close in 2017. They had taken the elephants off of the show in 2016. They, back in the 90s, built the Center for Elephant Conservation in Florida, and so that's where the elephants retired, and they also had a breeding program going there as well. But PETA definitely played a part in that decision, and attendance continued to decline after the elephants came off as well, and so it was a double hit for them.
The Milwaukee Circus Parade was excellent, and probably no chances of that ever coming back.
If someone wants to give us a couple $1 million to make it happen, I think we could do it. But unfortunately, it was a tremendous amount of work. Because just our wagon restoration program during that period of time was big, because the wear and tear on the wagons that happened, and so plus we'd be getting new ones and they restore them. But just the amount of labor it takes to get all those wagons on the flat cars and go to Milwaukee and unload them, and then there was the wardrobe people designing and sewing all of the costumes that the performers wore, and that was a pretty big deal. I never actually saw it. I've seen lots of photos and videos, so I have an idea, but I didn't witness it.
Well, and I assume animal rights again, because everything was pulled by animals.
Yes.
There was no motors in it.
Yes.
And they did have a 40-horse hitch, and
Yes.
it was excellent.
We still do Baraboo's Big Top Parade in the summer. So we roll about 14 of our wagons at that time, and we have the elephants in the parade as well. They get teams of horses from throughout the region to help pull those wagons. Sometimes we get a giraffe from Timbavani in Wisconsin Dells to ride in the wagon too. So we do that, but it is a much smaller scale than it is in Milwaukee.
Has anybody written any stories about some of the animals, personal involvement with the animals?
Yeah, a lot of trainers throughout the years would write books. Some are better than others. Some of them from the 20s and 30s are sort of funny to read. But and we have a large library of circus books in Baraboo, and so you can just go through the shelves, and there's a lot out there that exist of different performers' experiences.
A lot of personal relationships with the animals.
Seeing all these posters that you showed us, did they have a big printing company that went with them?
So they did not. There were a few different printing houses that existed. The Ringlings worked with Strobridge, which is out of Cincinnati, for a number of years. Cincinnati was a big place for printing.
That was publishing.
Yes.
Yes, Senator.
So there was a couple of, there was Donaldson, there was Erie, there was Strobridge. Those were the big names. Milwaukee had Riverside, which was a printing company too. But yeah, the volume, if you think of, they're hanging 6,000 posters any given day, think of what they would go through during the whole season. So yeah, it was definitely a big business. And so the printing companies liked the circuses for that reason.
It sounds very legal, but they scandals in the circus during the year as well.
Oh, there's always scandals. Well, one of them, so there was a performer named Lillian Lietzel, who was known for her one-arm changes. She would dislocate her shoulder like 100 times a night. The things you do, right? Who was involved with a male aerialist. It was this, big love affair, right? Then they both ended up, I don't remember if, so she fell to her death in Paris, rope or something like that, during the show. He went, mad, pretty much. He remarried another aerialist, and then they were getting divorced, and he went in and shot her and shot himself. So, there's some of those kinds of things. That's the best known one. There was a book written about Lillian Lietzel called Queen of the Air. It was written within the last 10 years. It's interesting because, it gives you all the facts, but it's written more in a story format. So they were gonna do a movie on it with Margot Robbie, but it didn't happen.
Who funds you? Is that
We're a state entity. So all of our assets have always been owned by the state of Wisconsin, by Wisconsin Historical Society. For 60 years, it was operated by Circus World Museum Foundation. So there was an operation agreement. But as of 2018, we started to begin the transition to be fully under the state. And so we now are one of the 12 historic sites in the state of Wisconsin.
Nice.
So what I understand is the success of the Ringling Brothers Circus, as you point out, was because of the 3 months they lived in Stillwater.
It's coming.
There's some research I have done points.
Just say yes. Just say yes. That's
I
all.
think you're on something. You should write a book about that.
Yeah.
Where did they go? Downtown, like the little park or up at the old athletic field?
I have no idea where.
You're
I know.
There's a lot of parks here.
Plane came in the house. They're not gonna
Right, and that was one. So at that time, I would imagine they would have performed fairly close to the depot. As cities grew, that helped to bring on the downfall of the parade. When cities grew, they had to travel further to get to the showgrounds lot, which was further from the downtown area. And so it was a lot more travel. So that, stopped. But they mentioned in the parade, and I don't know Stillwater, but a big hill. So as they said, something, because it was raining for the parade and the big hill was tough.
Maybe, yeah.
So yeah, I'm not sure, but that's apparently where the parade ran.
We're all gonna start guessing. now.
Imagination, yeah.
Right, it's wherever you want it to be.
especially with the hilly city.
Yeah, right.
How it is.
This may be a silly question, but can you talk more about Clown College and what that is and
So they
how that works?
would learn all of the skills. That's where most of the clowns would develop their face. Because clown makeup is very personal to different clowns, and so that's where you sort of develop the persona that you're going to be. But they learned all the different skills, whether it be juggling or stilt walking, or learning to write gags and all of those different things. And so it was up until the 90s, Clown College was an annual thing, and the top graduates of the college would get a place in the Ringling Brothers show, and that was coveted. You could obviously find work with other shows as well, but Ringling Brothers was the biggest that there was. We also, one of the things in our collection is the clown car, because they all slept together, in one real car. There's 11 rooms, and And so after the show closed in 2017, we acquired a couple of their rail cars. One of them is the clown car for the blue unit of Ringling Brothers. And so we have that. We're hoping at some point to be able to open it for tours. Obviously, it is there's a narrow pathway running through the side of it. You couldn't just make it a free for all for people. It wouldn't work, but spend the night in a clown car, right?
And then where can we visit you and when are you open?
So yeah, we opened for the spring season, mid-March. And so the buildings are open, our exhibits, but the performances start, it's usually around May 20th. All that information is available online. And then we generally close the Sunday before, well, it was early this year, right before the beginning of September, but before Labor Day, we close. And so we're open from 9 to 4 during that, and it's a packed day, things happening the whole time. If you're interested in more, the history, you can read the exhibits, go through the historic buildings that we have, that we're doing the quarters buildings, like the, shows and performance aspects. You can learn about being a clown, doing a big top show, and you can do a wine tour, and all of those different things too. So.
Thank you so much for being here.